Hello everyone. My name is Julio Noriega, Executive Forum's global CEO. Executive Forum's purpose is to accelerate the personal, professional, and business evolution of our members. A very warm welcome to each member and prospect members. Hope you're doing really well, and I'm really glad that you have joined this expert insight session. Um, Today, as you know, we are experiencing social, economic, and technology changes. The resulting business and political climate volatility forces us to develop the ability to adapt quickly to turn this context into future opportunities. Um, it is evident that in today's fast changing world, it's not so much what you know that counts anymore. Is how fast you learn. That skill is priceless. That's why we're here. Um, at Renaissance Executive Forums, we believe that if we do focus on high impact projects that can solve these challenges, we will find great business and purpose driven opportunities. And that is why, to take us on this journey, we have invited our guest, Jonathan Brill. Jonathan is very passionate about preparing leaders like yourself to profit from this radical change. He is the author of Rogue Waves. By the way, we will put a link to the book in the chat. He is a speaker and an advisor on resilient growth, decision making, and innovation under uncertainty, and a regular contributor to TED, Singularity University, Korn Ferry, JP Morgan, Forbes, and the Harvard Business Review. He's a true expert. His practical advice is based on decades of experience, both as an entrepreneur and a Fortune 50 tech executive at Hewlett Packard, as well as a managing partner of innovation consultancies that has developed over 350 products for clients such as Samsung, Microsoft, Verizon, PepsiCo, and the US government. He is currently the managing director of Resilient Growth Partners, a board member at Frost & Sullivan, and a futurist in residence at Territory Studio. Not only that, but he holds an industrial design degree from Pratt Institute, has spent years as a research consultant at the MIT Media Lab, and in management training at the Stanford University Graduate School of Business. As always, we will record this expert insight for our members, and please use the chat to exchange and ask questions. We will reserve time at the end for Q&A. So I hope that you truly enjoy this deep dive into this valuable leadership skill. And we will be talking about an upcoming opportunity with REF to do just that at the start of 2022. Welcome, Jonathan. Our platform is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and with such great leaders from around the world. So let's get started. Does your company seek to be above average? I mean, most companies do. The evidence, though, is that traditional strategies no longer deliver sustainable performance, whether it's scale, speed, differentiation. They're not enough. Best practices only deliver average results over time. We need a new strategy for growth, and I think it has something to do with risk. But But I think we think about risk all wrong. We think it's a measure of threat, but actually it's a measure of opportunity. It's a measure of change over time. In fact, more billionaires are minted in financial downturns than in upturns. The key to risk, the key to value capture, is making better bets while sidestepping threats. We need to innovate more than ever before if we want to outgrow the onslaught of disruption that's facing us, the rising volatility. But when disruption occurs, when real changes hit, politicians, CEOs, they turn around and they said it was a black swan, it was an incalculable event. The reality is that there are almost always traceable external factors that drive the change. The future is more knowable than you imagine if you have the right toolkit. Therefore, disruption is also more monetizable than we imagine. If management best practices keep us at parity, times of change are our opportunity to get ahead of our competition. We need to teach risk managers to talk the language of risk management. Risk managers have the best skills to identify high-value pain points for us and for our customers. But they don't talk to innovation teams. And while our innovators might understand things like risk mitigation, they don't understand how to really build complex scenarios about the future. Companies that design themselves for radical change had great years in 2020. For instance, the Universa Fund, which leverages long-tail risks. To be clear, this isn't a resources issue. It's a mindset issue. The winners of COVID aren't just Amazon and Zoom. They're also My Friend's Family Farm. They doubled their sales over COVID, while many of their competitors sank. If you know how to take advantage of disruption, you can win. But first you need to understand, what are these things? What is disruption? If most black swans aren't black swans, what are they? I think that they're what I call rogue waves. On the deep ocean, 100-foot tall walls of water like this one, they pop up in seconds to sink even the largest ships when smaller, individually manageable waves collide. And you have about this long to react. This is how disruption actually works. Individually trackable social, economic, and technological trends collide to become unmanageable. And when they do, they upend the playing field, making room for new winners. And that's why in downturns, you see 50% more companies entering the Fortune 100. And that's why I wrote my book, Rogue Waves. It turns out that there are best practices for taking advantage of change. It's based on $15 million of research that we did at HP as we restructured the firm to understand what we can and can't know about the future. Disruption, it turns out, is far more common than we think. Over the 20th century, major business shocks hit the United States about 4 times a year. If you believe that the world's getting more connected, it's moving faster, more rich people are doing more crazy things, we can expect that to increase. We think of rogue waves as an edge case, when actually, really, I think they're the main case. Managers spent nearly half of the 20th century bailing out of them as disruptions collided. The real question to ask is, are you prepared for the rare? Not, are you prepared for the quarter? Are you planning for what's likely instead of whatever the future holds? Here's an example. COVID is a rogue wave. What many leaders missed was that 100-year pandemics, they were just becoming more frequent, and we'd gotten better at containing them. You see, the issue isn't the disease itself. It's the other manageable waves of change that collided with COVID and created a domino effect. So that things that were containable in 2010 suddenly weren't containable in 2021. That's why so few leaders really consider the impact of someone sneezing in Wuhan. If you miscalculate the risk of radical change, it creates a threat. If your competitor does, and it appears that most competitors do, it creates an opportunity. Einstein said that insanity is doing the same thing but expecting different results. That might be true in physics where the rules remain the same. But if you play in business, the game constantly changes. And if it happens and no one else notices, that's your opportunity for opportunity. If we want to win the future, we need to rethink our relationship with risk. We did so in HP in the years before COVID. It saved money, it increased retention, and resilience to disruption. These things aren't necessarily a cost to your organization. And it helped HP do well in 2020. At the beginning of the year, Carl Icahn and Xerox were trying to take over the company. By the end of the year, as the market for printers, our major industry, shrank 9.4%, HP stayed steady, while Xerox, which appeared to be the better company, the one that could buy us, they had a 69% drop in earnings per share. While we did identify pandemics as a highly dynamic risk, what we were really interested in, what we were really concerned about was preparing to take advantage of change, no matter what the future held. So what did we do differently? We kept our eye on what I call the second domino. We didn't just focus on change on the pandemic or the natural disaster or the financial implosion. We focused on what happens next. We didn't have a COVID plan. We were pressure testing for the future, whatever it may hold. When designing HP's health diagnostics business, which was just funded before COVID, we looked at two trends: rising healthcare costs and pandemics. One would create a reliable growth curve no matter what happened, and the other would create a hockey stick of interest. What would happen if instead of avoiding threats, you planned to be overwhelmed and then to take advantage of it? Because you will be, and you'll make better decisions today for tomorrow. We assume that shocks come one at a time. What HP learned this year is that much like the waves in the deep ocean, they tend to come in threes. What does your company assume will happen next? Do you believe that the next chaos attack will wait for COVID to be over? That leaves you vulnerable to radical change. And it leaves you left out of the next opportunity. When you look at the causes of growth and failure, they break up into four broad buckets: financial, operational, external, and strategic change. It turns out that external and strategic threats were 3 times more likely to cause sustained decreases in firm value, and that managing for reliable results is an almost unattainable goal. Only 0.25% of companies actually do it well over time. And I might suck at statistics, but I think their success, it isn't their fault. Ask what combination of pressures would kill you. Innovate your processes there, and then ask your customer where you can provide radical value in times of radical change. Look at their 4 foes as well. If you do that and you innovate for those pain points, you stop solving procurement's problem and you start solving their board's problem. You move from being a tactical partner to being strategic. When a rogue wave hits more armor, it doesn't make you stronger. Nearly everyone capsizes, and the things that create stability hold you down. There's a good reason that you don't see a lot of aircraft carriers on Class 4 Rapids. What you really want to do is to flip your kayak faster, to take the market while your competitors are still bailing out from the last rogue wave. That's what Amazon and Zoom did this year, and the same with my friends, Family Farm. Investment and resilient growth, it's a long-term game, and it delivers superior outcomes over time. So the question to ask is, how do you create value for more years instead of how do you create value this year? So we've just discovered that rogue waves are monetizable, they're forecastable, they're becoming more frequent and creating new winners. Volatility is becoming greater as we move faster, we get more connected, more people have more money and can do crazy things. The rogue waves that these create are going to be the biggest opportunities of the next decade, if you're ready. But if you want to win the future, you need a strategy and you need a process that links resilience and growth, risk management and risk taking. And so how do you start? I think it's with what I call the ABCs of resilient growth. Awareness. Help your people explore the range of possibilities that can happen when knowable changes collide. Behavior. It doesn't matter if your people see the tsunami on the beach if they don't know how to surf the big wave, and you don't want to take up big wave surfing when the big wave hits. In culture, what are the processes? What are the incentives? What's the emotional space that you need to create in your organization to have these discussions and have real hard thinking about the future taken seriously? Based on the technology tracking that we do at HP and at Frost & Sullivan, it's clear to me that we can win the future, but the opportunities here, they're too big for any one company, even Amazon. We can know the drivers of the next rogue wave, and therefore we can know how they'll impact us when they collide. The challenge isn't that we can't know the future. The challenge isn't that we can't get ahead of it. The challenge is that we give ourselves blockers to resilient growth. Decades of poor strategy based on near-term shareholder returns have created false blockers, and we need to figure out how we rethink our organizations and how we rethink our governance in this time of change. The good news is that there are best practices, and you don't need to do it alone. And so I'd love to have a conversation with you at the end of this fireside chat about how we can get together and how we can build an exceptional future. Whether it's by sponsoring local salons, training and advisory work, or even better, building a forum, building a community where our organizations can combine to create what's possible. Thank you.
Awesome concepts, Jonathan. Thanks for sharing. Really valuable in today's environment. A few of those statements are so strong. You mentioned, for instance, creating radical value within an environment of radical change.
Absolutely.
And then you mentioned that they are not only foreseeable, but they're also monetizable. So
Yes.
strong. How do you set yourself to read the early signs? How would you, what would you advise business leaders to create a system to be hyper aware of what are the major shifts, what are the major trends that they should be looking out for?
That's a great question. It's totally possible. The first issue is, how large an organization are you, right? At HP, one scale of effort totally makes sense, right? If we're making multi-billion-dollar bets, spending 0.1% is a no-brainer. If you're if you're a small organization, that 0.1% gets much smaller. But what I can say is we identified 10 major trends that are really shaping the next decades. No matter what the cause, the seed of the next rogue wave is. And what you really want to do is start to take a look at what happens when those overlap. What would be the impacts on you? If you read the newspaper, right, they're really reporting what's going on today, not what's going on tomorrow, and typically not the deeper context. You want to go a little deeper. You want to be like looking at analyst reports. You want to be reading history, and have someone focused on doing that synthesis. If you're in a slightly larger organization, a mid to large organization, you really need to figure out how you get the people out there on the edge, aware of the range of change that's happening and communicating back to you in your organization uh, what that looks like. Because at the end of the day, it's likely the lookout, not the captain, that's going to see the iceberg first. What we did within HP was we had an analyst core of people with social, economic, technological, legal backgrounds, and we did kind of the analysis. But we built an intelligence organ across the organization, where I was talking to as many as 27,000 people, or half the organization, every year, just to try and get those telephone lines working, so people knew who to talk to, and they knew to call me if they saw something. And so you've got to get those mechanisms going, because, as there's almost always an early warning. Before Pearl Harbor, before the Japanese bombed the United States and started the U.S. war in the Pacific in World War II, there were communications from Hawaii, where the bombing took place, several days in advance, that went to the White House and weren't heard. You don't want to be that leader. Like, whatever you do, you don't want to be that leader who gets told and doesn't hear. So we've got to build these organs within our organizations. And the book's really a great starting point for how to think about that, whether you're small, medium, or large.
Most definitely. You talked about black swans, which are quote unquote unpredictable events. But usually what really happens, speaking of the animal kingdom, is that there are white or gray rhinoceroses out there that we could certainly spot if we are paying attention, if we are intentional about it. So with that in mind, I truly loved that quote: assume disruption and prepare for it.
Absolutely. You're going to be overwhelmed. I don't know why we always try to avoid it. Assume you're going to be overwhelmed. If you're doing anything cool, interesting, profitable, growth-oriented, risk-oriented, you're going to get hit. And so the question isn't how do you avoid getting hit? That's all important. The question is, what happens next? What's the second domino? And in our more volatile world, as we're all playing a global business game, we're going to get hit. And we've got to be thinking outside of our communities, outside of our businesses, to the supply chains around the world.
I totally agree. So, having said that, that's a very loud call, a very significant invitation for us to have an infinite mindset, to approach this from the possibilities, from an abundance mindset, as opposed to a threat or scarcity mindset. So
the reason there's so much risk in the world, there's so much calculable risk in the world, is that this is the first time in human history where we've had any of the real tools to see the future at all. Like, I don't know if you remember when you were a kid and the guy get on the TV or the radio with the weather report and it was total nonsense, and today you can rely on it. Well, that's a result of technological change, better sensors, all of these things. And those technologies, those capabilities are about to touch all of our businesses all at the same time. And so what's scary is not that the future is so much worse than it used to be. It's that we know so much more about it, right? This is the first time in human history that we've been able to say, hey, in 50 years, I'm really concerned about climate change, right? You might not buy the models. You might think they're not accurate enough. I happen to think that they're not as accurate as people say. But that said, we know directionally this is happening, because if you take a person out of rural poverty and you put them into the San Francisco, Austin, Texas, middle class, their resource consumption goes up about 32 times. And if you figure that between now or 2019, 2017, and 2035, another billion plus people will be entering that US level middle class using 32 times more resources. I don't care what your models say. That's going to be a massive change. We're putting so much more energy into the system, into every system, that it's going to cause rogue waves, and all of that energy is built up potential. It's built up human potential, it's built up economic potential, and all we need to do is figure out how to control it, how to extract it, how to engineer possibility. And so I'm not arguing for an emotional way of looking at the world where we can't know the future. And I'm not arguing for a super quantitative way of looking at it. What I'm saying is that there's a logic of tomorrow. And if we take the time to step back and look at the big picture and look at how those dominoes are going to fall, even if we don't know on what day, that's how you win the game.
Totally. Having said that, how would you propose to orchestrate change at the organizations? How would you articulate change? How do you get alignment at the shareholders level, at the board members level, at the C level, around why it's imperative to change? What is the new vision, the new strategy? How do we prioritize projects?
Well, it's a massive game, as we all know. You've done management consulting, and I'm sure, and you've gone in and you've talked to the C-suite, and you ask what's the corporate strategy, and you talk to them all at the same time, and there's one strategy, but then you talk to them one-on-one, and there's 12 different ones, right? We've got to get out of that mindset of it's my game or your game. We've got to change the processes. We've got to change the incentive structures so that we're all playing for the long term. I think that this new research that's come out of McKinsey that I mentioned earlier, recent study this month or last month, and published in the Harvard Business Review, is really damning to the shareholder value argument and the quarterly results argument. The performance results are just horrifying, and you can shift the perspective really quickly, and you can shift it as a performance-oriented organization. You've got to remember, HP gives back a massive dividend, right? They're hitting the quarter. If they don't hit the quarter, people, people lose their jobs. But they're doing that, and they're balancing the long term. And I think it has to do with having a big heart and big courage and saying, hey, here's the reality. We don't know the future. Here's the reality. I'm going to do my best to give you your quarterly results, right? But the reality is 0.25% of companies do that reliably over 5 years. Do you want us to be worth more 5 years from now than today so that your stock goes up? Or do you just want to extract money? And honestly, my perspective is I don't want the shareholders who just want to extract money. You've got to figure out how you're going to slowly shift. If you've gotten yourself into that problem, which is just really difficult to be in, you've got to figure out how to shift your shareholder mix. And that was one of the real problems that we saw, at HP, as I was talking about with Carl Icahn, coming in and buying up shares, you got to have that balance between the needs of the management and the needs of shareholders, right? But we've got to figure out how to get this back into balance, because otherwise, we're going to see what we're seeing, which is, companies stop being differentiated from each other. They stop playing their own game, and to try and maximize reliability and be at least as good as their competitors. And they stop thinking about the long term. They trade this quarter, for the future, or the future for this quarter. We gotta call it out when that's happening. It's a trade we all need to make sometimes. It's a trade we all have to make sometimes.
And
But
it
we've got to
requires
we've
brave
got to
leadership.
calculate the impact. You got to be clear about the impact of that decision.
Yes, only when you are hyper aware, only when you are convinced about that impact, is that a leader can be brave about it and can really talk about short term results versus sustainable value.
Absolutely. And
So,
you can't like, investors are smart people, right? Like they don't like to lose their money. Analysts are smart people. They don't like to lose their money. You've got to have a real story about the future that's compelling, that'll stand up to its day in court. And you got to be clear about it, and you got to follow through. And often it starts with small steps and bigger steps and bigger steps and bigger steps. But you've got to have that clear, articulate vision of the future that, no matter what happens, this future will happen. It might happen like we were talking about this healthcare diagnostics business. That future might happen slower. It might happen faster, but that future will happen, and it will happen, within your discounted cash flow window.
yeah,
Right?
and that future will have, when it happens, it will have big implications. And
Absolutely.
that puts us in a position where we need to make difficult decisions today. Uh, in that regards, how are we supposed to lead our new organizational structure? How are we going to um, realize that talent that we require for this new set of skills that are needed? How are we going to organize the company in terms of agility? How are we going to collaborate as an organization? Can we really get the company aligned in the key strategic initiatives? Those are really relevant questions. How do we understand where in the digital vortex are we? How impacted would we be, and how fast? Because that allows us to determine how I should approach innovation. Should I approach it incrementally? Should I approach it disruptively? What are your thoughts about this, Jonathan? What's your advice to the business leaders in this predicament?
So you managed to summarize all of the questions of the book in one question, which is absolutely fantastic. So let me try and dissect it a little bit. I think the number one thing we need to figure out how to do coming out of COVID is, as we return to the office, this is our chance to change how we do three things. One, how we have meetings. We all know that meetings are just the biggest time suck in our organization. So be really intentional about how you structure meetings, having agendas for meetings, making sure that those agendas get paid off, and making sure that the people who commit at the end of the meeting follow through. So much of that doesn't happen, and so you have meetings that are nonsense. The second is get everybody in your organization better at giving directions. I used to be a terrible personnel manager. I still am. But one of my employees, he was the former special forces officer, one of these big guys, that you don't screw around with. And, I fly in and I'd say, hey, I'm do this thing that I've half thought about, and then I'd disappear for 2 weeks. And I drove him nuts. And I said, here's how we do things, when we're going across enemy lines, doing things where if there's going to be an international incident, if I screw up, here's how I give an order. And, I stood to attention, and I was like, all right. He said, a couple of things. One, What's the context? What do you know and not know about the situation, and what's likely to change? Really simple thing to do once you think about it. The second, what's the objective, and what's my objective for you? The third, how do I want you to approach risk? This is what I call risk bands. How much risk do I want you to take, and how little do I want you to take it? And giving that window is critical. Otherwise, people go nuts or people don't do anything. The next thing is, who's in charge while I'm gone, right? Inevitably, I've given you, as a senior leader, I've given you half directions. So, who makes the decision when I'm not there? And how do you move forward when I'm not there? Who communicates with you? As a leader, we often forget to give that piece of information. And then the last piece is, if everything goes crazy and I'm not in town or I'm on vacation or I don't come back, because I've certainly done that. I've had consulting engagements where the client just doesn't appear for 3 months. What do I do? And if you just give people that information when you give a direction and you teach your people to do that, you've suddenly given everybody in your organization all of the information they need to innovate on your behalf. And so you don't spend as much time in stupid meetings, and everyone has the directions that they need to innovate for you. The second thing is giving people, sorry?
Go ahead. I was saying also.
Is giving people the tools that they need to speak up in ways that you're going to hear. This doesn't mean that you're not responsible for listening to those snippets from around the organization of people who don't have your context. But people, if we're going to flatten our organizations, if we're going to be more agile, if we're going to move faster, that means people much lower down need to build executive communication skills, basic executive communication skills very early in their career. And so here's what you should ask them to do and train them to do when you interact with them. One, what's the logic of what you're saying, right? Just, it might be good logic, it might be bad logic, but what's the logic? The second is empathy. Now, if I'm a junior employee or a consultant, I probably don't really understand your job as a leader. So a great way to start is to say, I think this is your problem, right? I think this is your problem. I understand it, but could you give me some more information around that so that I can really understand? And so you build better contextual awareness across the organization just really quickly in the conversation. The third is authority. Even though I might not have positional authority as a junior employee, right? Maybe I was a babysitter, or maybe I was an intern, or maybe there was that day when I saw the iceberg when I was boating, during college, whatever it is. So you have some reason that maybe your insights are useful. And then the last piece is a deadline, right? When's the earliest and when's the latest we need to make a decision? We can go as long as we want on this, but the iceberg's going to hit on Wednesday. And if you give people those skills to talk to you, all of a sudden they have removed almost all of the political blockers, right, that could hit them on the way up. And you've removed all of the excuses for middle managers to screw around and not get the information to you. So you got to get those two things in place.
Recently, one of the members of headquarters mentioned a great concept to me, and it referred to a book called The Messy Middle. I love the concept, the messy middle. I think you're referring to some extent to that messy middle as well. And I am going to tie it up with Paul Selly's question, which says, how do you get companies to forecast budgets and assuming past costs and current situations? How do you get these companies to adapt faster under this scenario of disruption? So I'm going to tie the two. How do you get companies to be more agile as well in their planning, would you recommend to do it quarterly, and how would you structure it?
Yeah, well, I think, within large organizations, it's really easy to do the annual plan, and you run for 6 months, and then you spend 3 months politicking, and then you spend 3 months budgeting, and then 3 months acquiring. All of a sudden, a year later, nothing's happened. And so I think you really need to have a rolling 12-month plan. And that was hard, a number of years ago, but with digital transformation, a lot of that's easier. And then the second is, we've got to stop looking at procurement as a way to save money. Yes, we need to be smart in terms of how we spend. But if it takes us 6 months to buy a $5,000 thing, like, what are you doing? I had a thing, I did my calculations, and I was spending more at one point justifying my travel expenses than I could have possibly stolen from the company. And I was like, what is the logic of this? Is insane. What are you doing with your procurement? The goal should be to help your company move faster and in a smart way, as opposed to trying to control expenses, because controlling expenses is important, but profitability and speeding your cycles is far more important in most cases.
I totally agree, Jonathan. And we've talked about high-level concepts. So Conrado Salcedo asks, by the way, he first thanks you for your time and wisdom, but then he says, would you be able to share some examples of decisions, of radical changes made for or with companies that you have worked for?
That's a great question. So, a lot of the work that I do, is under pretty strict lock and key in terms of those decisions. They're pretty secret, but they range from things like helping an organization whose R&D pipeline wasn't fitting with their future customer, and helping them figure out how to develop literally 1,000 new product concepts that got brought down to 20 products that went to market. 100 products that went to market across a number of billion-dollar brands, over a dozen billion-dollar brands. And so the goal there was really to just foundationally understand who is that future customer, what are their needs, where will they buy these things, what are the economic criteria for making those decisions. So that was a pretty massive kind of side skunkworks R&D capability, directly with the CEO of a Fortune 100 company. Another decision we made, another thing I've worked a lot on is, workforce of the future types of challenges. So what types of skills does a large organization need in the future? More importantly, where are they available? So when you take a look at the 4-year degree or equivalent, and you look out to 2030, there's about 1.2 million person shortage in the state of California in the United States. And the only country on the planet that's going to have about 1 million person excess capacity of those is going to be India. And so we have this foundational problem as leaders, as countries, as CEOs, of how do we lead in a future where we can't get talent anymore? Right, where literally the entire world is looking for talent because of changing demographics, and India's got just enough to backfill California, and the entire rest of the planet has to figure out how to do more with less. We've done a lot of work on that. How do we scrounge those skills in the future? How do we use our people more effectively? Things they might have known in the past to transition them to roles in the future. So, for instance, one of the big things going on right now is decreases in accounting costs, right? Like if you've got bookkeepers in Guadalajara or bookkeepers in Costa Rica or in Sri Lanka, those are costs you want to constrain. They don't provide new value for the organization. And so we're looking at robotic process automation and AI and all of these things to try and remove that kind of labor overhead. But what do you do with those people? Well, it turns out they've got really good quantitative skills. They're really comfortable with computers. They are willing to do repeat work. So these people actually have a lot of the core skill set to move into a data science capability with a few months of additional training, and they've got the mindset to do it. And so all of a sudden, you can take these people who were about to be out of a job and turn them into the people you couldn't hire because they weren't available. So you got to get a lot smarter, I think, when you look at your company about how can your people constantly be upskilled, and what role, what responsibility do you have in doing that? In the U.S., we seem to have this belief that people will work 60 hours a week and get MBAs and then continue doing continuing ed, and they'll do it on their own nickel. I'm not sure how that works. Like as leaders, we've got to figure out how to increase the value of our people and how to have that be a really strong partnership so that they want to stay with us over time. And we're increasingly getting the value as opposed to raising them up until the time they're 45 or 50 or 55, and then their skills are 20 years out of date.
Totally.
We've got to find people that are worth what we're paying them.
Upskilling and reskilling is certainly, in my view, the responsibility of the CEO. You have built a company together. Now things are changing. They're changing faster. You're asking your C-level to produce quarterly results. The last thing they want, it's another training session. They don't have time for it. And unless that quote unquote upskilling, reskilling session is truly led by the CEO, and it's not necessarily called a training session, but it's about mobilization. It's about alignment. It's about maintaining relevance and making you sustainable in this environment. Otherwise, it's going to happen what you just described. It's going to get to a point where you are going to have to let go the team that got you there, because they won't have the skills to address the new challenges ahead. So upskilling and reskilling, led by the CEO, is key.
And I would add a second piece to that. I completely agree with you. And we give people economic incentives to specialize, right? This is the second piece. We need to give people economic incentives to generalize. And what do we mean by that? When you look at the future, the biggest problem I see organizations having is that everybody thinks they've got the skill set to do that, right? The English major imagines, the economist builds models, the mechanical engineer, does decision trees. The computer scientist, they build, innovation portfolios and weight them. Finance people probably do similar things, but none of them really understand what each other do or how to talk across those silos of knowledge. And we've got there are really 5 major silos of knowledge, and they're in the book, that we need to figure out how to get into our teams and how to help them at least have the pigeon to communicate. An example. So when I was writing the book, a colleague of mine is a leader in a major research and development lab, and she's an English major. And she's been saying there's a problem with our human resources and how we onboard, and it's causing retention issues and so on and so forth. She's been saying this for 3 years to the president of the organization. not heard. She reads the book and she's like, oh, this guy has a PhD in artificial intelligence. I've got to like start talking about this as like a systems model. And so she goes into his office, gets a marker, goes up on the board, and starts drawing like a spaghetti diagram and saying, this is how this was all connected. This thing, this thing, this thing, this thing. And this here's where the problem is. All of a sudden, 90 minutes later, bang, all of the decision making about the entire process of the organization has changed. All the budgets are freed up, and she has free room to run to reorganize the way that they do training, learning and development, and onboarding within this massive organization. And so if you just have the ability to understand how other people think about the future, then you have the ability to amplify your impact as a team. And
Totally.
That's the real opportunity that we need to be training our people to do today.
Awesome, Jonathan. I think that we could discuss this forever. So many issues to address. Thank you for sharing the wisdom. We're coming on the hour and we need to start closing. So I have a final remark, but would you like to say something to the audience to close this expert insight session?
I'm incredibly excited to be here. I think as leaders, we need to really start having this conversation about how we as a community of organizations shape the future, shape it together. There's too much risk, by which I mean there's too much opportunity for any of us to do this alone. And we need to get together, have that better conversation, whether it's as an executive forum, whether it's as salons within your communities. I'm always glad to help do that kind of thing. Or whether it's advisory and training. I'm here for you, and this is my passion. How do we make better decisions today to have an excellent tomorrow?
Thank you for those wise words, Jonathan, and to the community that is present today. If you are intrigued by what you heard today, well, we have some good news. We expect and hope that during Q1 2022, Jonathan and Rev will lead some future talk series, intimate sessions built for exchange with limited spots available. And if you are ready to take this deep dive into this valuable mindset and skill set, please fill out the link in the chat that we will send for more information on these sessions. And I do invite you to lead your organizations into the future. And as Jonathan put it, create radical value out of radical change. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you so much to each and one of you for joining us in this Expert Insight session. I wish you the best. Stay safe and lead bravely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And thank you so much to the REF team. This has been an incredible, incredible time.
Awesome, Jonathan. Thank you. Thank you. Stay well. Bye-bye.